This film is an accusation. Accusation of a crime against humanity committed by the authorities of Azerbaijan and the Gorbachev wing of the Soviet authorities in the spring-summer of 1991. Accusation of a genocide of the Armenian population during Operation Ring, committed not only on the territory of Soviet Azerbaijan, but also on the bordering areas of Soviet Armenia. Operation Ring is an act of state terror against the civilians of 26 Armenian villages. Time conducted: April-August 1991. Location: Stepanakert and the regions of Shahumyan, Shushi, Martakert and Hadrut in Karabakh, as well as Noemberian, Goris and Tavush regions of Soviet Armenia. Authors and performers: Ayaz Mutalibov, Viktor Polyanichko, Mogamed Asadov, Mikhail Gorbachev, Boris Gromov, SWAT of the Azerbaijani SSR, People's Front of Azerbaijan, units of internal troops of the Ministry of the Interior of the USSR and the Soviet Army. Experts from the book by Caroline Cox and John Abner, Ethnic Cleansing in Progress, War in Nagorno-Karabakh. Operation Ring started in late April 1991 with the villages of Getashen and Martunashen. These names will be seared onto the memory of Armenians alongside Baku and Sumgait for the brutality of the suffering inflicted on their people. The operations carried out against vulnerable villagers were remarkable for their ferocity. This is Getashen, one of the largest Armenian villages torn away from Armenia in the beginning of the 20th century. Getashen's population used to reach 5,000. It was exactly this village which became the first target of Operation Ring. Russian writer and publicist Inessa Burkova testifies.
Listening to what the refugees are telling is beyond human ability. Worn out with maddened eyes, they were living through the horror again, which they survived in their own village. Artillery shelling, armed vehicles rattling on the streets, raving crowds of civilians screaming, crying, praying for help, relatives smashed by the missiles, body of a slain brother which a tank just passed over, flesh on the tracks of the crawlers, neighbors axed into pieces, women raped en masse, burning houses and schools turned into ruins, Azerbaijani cars loaded with looted stuff.
This was the beginning of Operation Ring. However, forceful deportation and the genocide of Armenian population had begun much earlier. From the report by Russian Human Rights Center Memorial. In the winter of 1989-1990, the residents of 3 villages, Kushi Armavir, Azad and Kamo, were forced to leave their settlement area because of the incessant armed attacks and pressure by the regional authorities and commanders of internal troops.
If it was not for the shepherd who warned us, they would have slaughtered us all.
They are beasts. What's going on? Why aren't you reacting? What are we supposed to react or respond with?
A stick? A stick against Alazan?
Viktor Krivopuskov, chief of the headquarters of the Investigative Task Force of the Ministry of Interior of the USSR in Nagorno-Karabakh during 1990-1991. Excerpts from Rebellious Karabakh novel. As a discreet raid by our team proved, a few dozens of illegal SWAT teams existed in Azerbaijan, armed with machine guns. In the afternoon, they were asleep in special bases on the territory of Azerbaijani settlements, while at night they would raid the Armenian villages, cattle farms, outrage on the highways. They would kill and loot. There were incidents of killing and looting Azerbaijani residents as well.
За последние несколько месяцев стало появляться.
In the last few months, information was received that some secret SWAT, of course illegal, was formed on the territory of Azerbaijan. They generally engaged in livestock theft and raids. Once information reached Martakert that there had been an attack on a family, and I went to them. The husband was Armenian and the wife was Azeri. They had little children and lived in a small house. As they told me, 4 to 5 people in SWAT uniforms had broken into their house at night, armed with guns, and opened fire. And then they had taken away the cattle, the flour, and basic foodstuff in general. The bullets had passed over the cot literally at 5 centimeters from it. Had the little girl risen a bit, she would have been killed. I started questioning the woman. She claimed that they were Azeris because she was Azeri herself, knew the language perfectly, and was able to discern the Azeris from the Armenians. From Viktor Krivopuskov's book, Rebellious Karabakh. Back in November 1990, our investigative task force got secret materials of Azerbaijani authorities with a deportation plan of the Armenian population from the villages of Khanlar and former Shahumian regions. At the session of the Supreme Council of Azerbaijani SSR in the beginning of February 1991, the deportation plan of the Armenian population from the Republic was in fact approved. While working on this movie, we managed to identify the copies of those documents. Their technical condition does not allow looking into the details, but they confirm the very fact of existence of the Armenian population deportation plan. In the autumn of 1990, this plan was not only approved at the session of Supreme Council of Azerbaijani SSR in the beginning of 1991, but also coordinated later with the Security Council of the USSR. Since March 25, 1991, the Azerbaijani SWAT, OMON, had begun regular shelling of Getashen and Martunashen villages. Among the victims was Aramay Saakyan, 12, who was shot to death by a sniper on his way home from school. From the report by the Memorial Human Rights Center, documents obtained by Memorial Center provide serious grounds to believe that decisions on deporting the residents of a number of Armenian-populated villages of Nagorno-Karabakh and adjacent areas were taken on the sessions of Defense Council of Azerbaijan Republic, April 10, 1991, Presidium of Supreme Council of the Azerbaijani Republic, April 11, 1991, and at a conference at the President of the Azerbaijani Republic, Mutalibov, with the heads of KGB, Ministry of Interior, and Prosecutor's Office, April 16, 1991. On March 14, 1991, the European Parliament passed a resolution calling Gorbachev to put an end to the attacks on the safety of population in Karabakh and the nearby Armenian populated areas, which is apparently being subject to mass deportation. The Azerbaijani SWAT committed horrible atrocities those days. Everything was permitted to them. They invaded the homes under the pretext of checking the passports, as if looking for fighters. But they were not really interested in passports. They were just robbing, looting, taking away the whole livestock, behaving like barbarians and bandits before the civilians, even to the extent of raping women in front of their husbands' eyes. All of this, of course, was to instigate hatred and cause Fidai detachment to be created to protect the villages with much courage. Echo Moskvy radio was reporting those days. As agreed with the Security Council of the USSR, the SWAT of Azerbaijan, totaling 1,000 personnel, will participate in the activities. The troops and the SWAT units are subject to the Ministry of Interior of Azerbaijan. The operation is headed by the Minister of Interior of Azerbaijan. 3 high-ranking officers from the Defense Ministry, Interior Ministry and KGB of the USSR have arrived in Nagorno-Karabakh. Similar groups are set up and acting in all the regions. These officials act with cover names. Their ranks and positions are conditional. This is the document named Table of Cover Names of Officials, another proof of the plan of forceful deportation of Armenian civilians, having been designed as a real military operation, employing significant military power, weaponry and aviation. In his book Rebellious Karabakh, Viktor Krivopuskov brings the chronology of immediate preparation of ring operation. At 1410, April 9, high-ranking officials of the USSR Interior Ministry, headed by the first Deputy Minister, Colonel General Boris Gromov, arrive in Nagorno-Karabakh. According to the words of Inessa Burkova, the operation was in fact managed by Boris Gromov, who had tested his scheme in Afghanistan and had copied it exactly 1-to-1 in Karabakh. In Afghanistan, it was all happening this way. The intelligence would report that there were mojaheds in the village. Then the village would be surrounded with vehicles and troops, helicopters would fly above, and loudspeakers would announce that if they go out and surrender, the village would not be touched. They would refuse, and firing would start. The troops would move in and start the cleansing. As a matter of fact, there was exactly the same cleansing going on in Getashen, using the same scheme. Getashen is located in a valley surrounded by mountains, and all the heights were occupied with tanks. If in the small Martunashen I counted 28 tanks, then imagine how many of them were in Getashen. April 10, 11 sharp. Gromov leaves for Moscow urgently. April 10, 16 to 19 hours. Session of the Defense Council of Azerbaijan. Key reporter, Minister of the Interior, Major General of Internal Service, Asadov. From the files of hearings in the Human Rights Committee of the Supreme Council of the Russian Federation. On April 19, 1991, the personnel of internal troops of the Interior Ministry of the USSR, deployed in the village of Getashen, was withdrawn from the village. At the same time, radio and telephone communication was blocked, energy supply was seized, and air flights forbidden. As the northern gate of Artsakh, Getashen was the most convenient platform for the subsequent advancement into the depth of the territory inhabited by Armenians. This is exactly the reason why Operation Ring started with Getashen and the neighboring Martunashen. Azerbaijan's commitment to the Turkish policy of genocide was emphasized by the ritualistic nature of the activity to deport the 2 Karabakh villages. The fact that April 24, the memorial day of the 1915 genocide of Armenians, was chosen as the day for a new genocide, had its ominous meaning, cynically highlighting the unity of goals and methods of the slaughterers of the beginning and the end of the 20th century. However, the attack on April 24 failed. We were expecting them to start on April 24, and indeed, early in the morning, powerful armored vehicles entered Getashen. But on the way, one of the tanks fell into the canyon. The men of the village gathered to meet with the captain of the Soviet troops. He said, "We were told that only commandos lived in the village, but we can see many children around." And our children would leave their homes to play around the tanks. So they were convinced that there are no civilians in Getashen, just the commandos. That day they pulled their tank out of the canyon and left the village, having confirmed that we live here with our families and protect ourselves with our own force. But on April 30, they came again. This is the unique footage of the last minutes of preparation for the attack by the units of the Soviet army, forced to commit the criminal orders of the criminal commanders. A few more minutes, and the tanks, having made a turn, will take direction towards the Armenian villages Getashen and Martunashen. The punitive machine of the powerful state, armed to the teeth, will hit the civilians with its entire power. Inessa Burkova testifies. On April 30, 5 a.m., the military operation Ring against the civilians of Getashen and Martunashen began. Surrounded by tanks and armored vehicles, the villages were taken under heavy fire. A few hours later, the armored vehicles intruded the territory, while soldiers and SWAT commandos were moving forward covered by them. They were shooting from their guns, followed by Azerbaijani looters from neighboring villages. They were storming into the houses, killing people, beating, robbing Armenians, carrying away their property, cars, cattle, forcing them to write declarations on their willingness to leave their homes for good. Radio Liberty observer Elizabeth Fuller was reporting. On April 30, 37 people were killed in Getashen and Martunashen, including women and children. Over 100 were wounded. Inessa Burkova testifies. Even the most elderly did not see any remorse. Women were beaten up too. Their ears were cut off to take the earrings, and some of them were raped. 43 people were taken hostage. 14 of them were carried away in unidentified direction. 29 were taken to Akjakend, where they were locked in a bus and 2 days on end were beaten up with boots, clubs and gun grips. Every single one of those 29 captives was tortured. On the third day, the SWAT militants exchanged them with 14 captive soldiers and a colonel. But what they returned to Getashen were bloody medleys with damaged internal organs, broken arms, legs, ribs, skulls.
Over 100 residents of the two captured villages were beaten, wounded, mutilated.
I was especially shocked by what happened to the father and son Chilingarians. The father had lost his leg in World War II. They told that they were captured by the Azerbaijanis, put into a bus and beaten on the way. It's hard to imagine, but the disabled elderly man was beaten by his own crutch, while his son was tortured and humiliated in front of his eyes. They quenched cigarettes on his body, bet and ridiculed him, threw him on the floor, and several people jumped on him. Then they raised his head by the hair and removed his scalp, and all this in front of the father's eyes. Radio message from Getashen. SOS, SOS, SOS. We, the residents of two Armenian villages in Azerbaijan, Getashen and Martunashen, beg for saving our lives. We are under pressure by tanks in our houses and yards. Children, women, and elderly are taken captives by Azerbaijani SWAT soldiers. They are breaking our arms, legs, and ribs by hitting against the walls, taking off the skulls, damaging the kidneys, stabbing with knives, and forcing us naked into the streets. We are compelled to leave our native villages. Our houses have been looted, set on fire, and we have nowhere to hide. People of the world, save us. Save at least our children. We are dying, being cut off the external world by the surrounding tanks. SOS, SOS, save us. The situation in the village was already hard. The only connection was the telegraph. I would somehow stealthily come in, transmit the message, and leave. They followed me and said, "We will not kill you, we'll capture you alive," as Deputy Minister Mamedov assigned, so that you can explain to him on what authority you work on the communications. I don't understand, does Azerbaijan own all the rights in this world? Or do we have a center? Do we have Moscow where they are supposed to be thinking of the people? The policy of state terror against the civilians, mass violations of human rights, and forceful deportation from the locations of historic habitation brought about the formation of units of people's resistance. In Getashen and Martunashen, a history teacher, Tatul Kırpeyan, and the geologist, Simon Achikosyan, became the leaders of self-defense. They both heroically died on April 30. Armenian leaders applied to Gorbachev and Pugo, and the latter replied that there are commandos there and the military action was to destroy the commandos. I haven't seen any commandos. Later I have seen Fidais, of course, but they were the defenders who saved the women, children and elderly. They were not commandos, but real men who were protecting the weak, and not only their relatives, from unfair massacre. Radio Liberty observer Elizabeth Fuller informed. Despite Gorbachev's promise on May 1 to take measures to prevent bloodshed, both villages were subject to second attack on May 2. Martunashen was burnt down to earth. Who is left in Martunashen now? But is there any Martunashen left so that anyone could live there at all? There's nothing anymore. No house, no inhabitant, nothing. Everything was burnt down. As if it was not enough that we were ousted from our own homes, the Turks even followed us to the forest to kill us all. People would hide anywhere they could, in the river, behind the stones or the trees. Many had infants with them, several months old, or even a 2-week-old child. We don't know what happened to them. Then they surrounded the village with guards so that they could easily do looting. The villagers had cars, well, they took them away and started to ransack the houses, load the stolen stuff on the cars and carried away. The emptied houses were set on fire. That is how the entire village was burned. We made our way here in 3 days through the forests. But what happened with the other inhabitants of Martunashen? We are not aware. They either reached Getashen or died in the forest, nobody knows. Sumgait was not enough for them. They reached Martunashen. My son served in the army in Afghanistan. He returned home alive, and the Turks killed him. Not even a year has passed. Let Gorbachev give my son back. Again, it were the Armenians to blame. This is all I could take with me from my house. May 4. President Gorbachev still hypocritically insists. The issue of deportation of Getashen's and Martunashen's population has been closed. Nobody has the right to force these villagers into leaving their habitation area. whereas Inessa Burkova was reporting from the event location. On May 4 and 5, 1,317 people were transported into Stepanakert on helicopters and then over to Armenia. May 6 and 7, another 1,100 people. Around 2,500 civilians were thrown out of their own homes, from their native villages. They were made homeless, powerless refugees. But over 500 young and middle-aged men who were also thrown out into the street were arrested and taken away to unidentified locations. Apparently, this was done to use tortures and force them into acknowledging themselves commandos. May 7. The last Armenian left Getashen. Both Martunashen and Getashen were left without a single resident. The two villages were given to SWAT and the Azerbaijanis of the neighboring villages for looting. Soon they were inhabited by Azerbaijanis. On June 14, 1990, Bakinsky Rapochi newspaper informed that already 3,000 Azerbaijanis live in Getashen. On July 4, Gorbachev signed a decree to award the Red Star Medal to 7 members of Azerbaijani SWAT for participation in fights over disarmament of commandos in Khanlar region of Azerbaijan. In other words, for the operation to deport Getashen's and Martunashen's population. I call on behalf of the entire Armenian nation to award that, well, I'm not saying Comrade Gorbachev, damn him, Gorbachev, Yazov and the other one, with a hero medal for being able to capture our villages of Getashen and Martunashen. Other leaders are fighting with hostile countries, while these are fighting against their own nation. Write down my name, Simon Hovsepian, and pass on my suggestion to award them for victory over their population. By mid-May, the direction of main attack of the ring operation shifted eastwards. This road leads to 4 Armenian villages of former Bertadzor sub-region of Shushi region. It was right here, the top of the mountain, where the ring operation reached in the middle of May. A few days in advance, we knew that the Soviet army was to come into the village for passport checkup. They had come a couple of times before, but this time they came in order to deport the villages. After the Soviet troops, the Azerbaijani SWAT came in and started acting not paying attention to the Soviet troops. All the men of the village, irrespective of age, including myself, were collected and carried away to Lachin. They kept us there for a day and a half, then returned part of the group to the village, while the others were sent to Shushi, Kirovabad, Baku. A day later, the deportation of the village began, along with other villages of Bertadzor. Reference: in the beginning of May 1991, the first International Sakharov Congress kicked off in Moscow. The information on the deportation of the Armenian population of Karabakh convinced the participants to urgently delegate an international task force into the conflict zone. The group included 15 human rights defenders, representing Russia, the USA, Great Britain, Japan, and Norway. The delegation was headed by the member of British Parliament, Baroness Caroline Cox. From the report by the delegation of the First International Sakharov Congress, a young 20-year-old woman, Barserian, from Bertadzor region, told the following. On May 13, 6 in the morning, the village was surrounded by the internal troops of the Ministry of Interior of the USSR and units of Azerbaijani SWAT. They tied her husband and his brother and pushed them into the bus. They gave her a document stating that she is voluntarily leaving the village and insisted on her signing it. She did, as she was very frightened. She had a 1-year-old kid. The soldier came up to the kid, took him by his head and said, "You are Armenians. This is why I have to cut your tongues." She jumped on the soldier to protect her kid. The soldier raped her, but left the kid alone. Witnesses told that in the village of Metshen, a man was killed with 30 shots in the throat in front of the eyes of his pregnant wife and his children for trying to protect his wife from beating. A preacher was killed for trying to object to the soldiers who accused him of armed resistance. The Azerbaijani SWAT fighters were searching the houses, beating, raping, collecting and then carrying away the people. The Soviet troops never interfered, but in reality, they backed up their actions. The SWAT commandos were acting highly impudently. They were scattered all over the village, entered the houses with groups and forced the owners to write and sign papers about giving up their residence in the village, as if they did not want to live in Bertazor any longer, and requested to be moved to a different area. All that was done at gunpoint, accompanied with beating, violence, insult and humiliation. People, of course, were horrified. Unarmed elderly, women, children. What could they do? 16 people were carried away to Baku, where a whole year an alleged investigation was underway, using their methods, of course. A year later, we were tried and accused of murder, being called Armenian extremists and terrorists. But what kind of terrorism could that be if we were only protecting our village? I spent 5 years and 2 months in Baku, of which 4 years as a death convict. Each second we expected to get killed. 2 of the commandos died in the prison because of malnutrition, beating, horrifying conditions in the cell of death convicts. From the report by the delegation of the First International Sakharov Congress. An elderly disabled man from Bertazor village of Metshen told the members of the delegation, "On May 14, 1991, helicopters began circling over the village and units of Azerbaijani SWAT moved in. All the men were tied together, thrown into the bus and carried away. The younger men were beaten up in such a way that they could not have children in the future." The malignant metastasis of ring operation spread all over Karabakh. The villages of Hadrut area were attacked in June. On May 15, Echo Moskvy radio informed. Several filtration points were set up by the decision of USSR Security Council, acting under the aegis of the Ministry of Interior of the USSR and the Ministry of Interior of Azerbaijan. Lachin, Jebrail, Fizuli, Mirbashir and Shushi. All the arrested were brought to these points. It was right here, the square in front of the militia building in Jebrail, that all the captives from the villages of Hadrut were brought to. At first they were given out to crowd for mutilation. Then they were filtered. Part of them was set free, while others were sent to jail in Shushi or in Baku. Some of them were later exchanged, others were sold, yet others died of tortures, beating, and intolerable conditions of life. The destiny of many of the captives taken hostage during the ring operation is unclear up until now.
I am really in Donola because of the courage of an Armenian woman called Anna. And I said, I insist to go to village where deportations have taken place. Possible. I met Anna and she said, I want to show you my village.
Baroness Cox arrived in the village with other foreigners. Azerbaijanis tried to prove that there had been no deportation at all, whereas by that time 17 villages had already been deported. I turned to Baroness Cox myself, asking her, "Have you been to those villages? Have you made sure yourself, is there any deportation or not?" At that moment, the Prosecutor General of Azerbaijan, Gaibov, who had arrived with them, asked me, "Are you sure that there has been a deportation? Can you prove that?" I said, "Yes, I'm sure." Then they tried to convince me not to do it. Gaibov came up to me and whispered, "Do you realize that the SWAT will make mincemeat out of you? They will tear you into parts for that." But I thought, come what may, and boarded on the helicopter. Once we landed in Dolanlar, around 100 SWAT commandos approached us. I was surprised and asked who they were guarding there. And the response was that Azerbaijanis were brought there to settle, and the reason for guarding them is not to let them escape. They saw that there is nothing around indeed. They burned all the houses, leveled everything to the ground with a bulldozer, so that not even a trace of the Armenians is left. With that, the Azerbaijanis who came with us were trying to prove the Baroness and others that these people were the residents of this very village. July 6 to 10. Internal troops are withdrawn from the Shahumyan region. USSR Defense Minister Yazov forbids the flights of civilian helicopters into Shahumyan region. The Azerbaijani SWAT attacks the villages of Erkech, Buzluh and Manashit. Resistance from the villagers forced them to retreat, and the units of the 23rd Division of the 4th Army are engaged again, with tanks and other armored vehicles. July 15. MiG-23 interceptors are used to bombard Erkech village with missiles and bombs. For the first time in the history of the USSR, military aviation is used against Soviet civilians. The people are forced into leaving the village. The tanks and armored vehicles are firing at the civilians, leaving 4 women and a child dead. On July 24, the army units and Azerbaijani SWAT teams of Interior Ministry, using artillery and helicopters, began shelling of one of the biggest villages in Nagorno-Karabakh, Verin Shen, with a population of 5,000. They brought us to Verin Shen, where we lived. Continuous shootings were heard, and people were telling us about all the horrors they had lived through. We knew about the wounded children, the slain boy. We met a teacher whose son was killed, and she had no relative left. We knew that all the nearby villages were surrounded, and we were shocked by the fact that the 23rd Soviet Army participated in these events on the Azerbaijani side by helping them to surround the villages, not leaving the residents out, committing cleansing and deportation. In front of their eyes, women, children and elderly people were raped, robbed and killed. Their homes were destroyed, and all this was concealed by our soldiers. Reference: Karabakh Committee of Russian Intelligentsia, KRIK. The founding session took place in the beginning of April 1991 in Moscow. Due to the activity of KRIK and other Russian activists, the criminals did not manage to conceal the true scope of breaches of human rights of the Armenian population during the Ring operation. A group of parliament members from Moscow, Colonel Vladimir Smirnov, Viktor Shenis, Anatoly Shabad and others, set up a live watch in the Verin Shen village of Shahumyan region. Deportation of Verin Shen in the summer of 1991 was prevented. End of July, beginning of August. The ring of terror starts to squeeze around the villages of Martakert region. Haterk, one of the largest villages in Karabakh, was circled all around the perimeter of the mountains surrounding the village. He says, take this one too. I'm asking, on what authority? Who are you? I'm a war veteran. I went up to Berlin. And he tells me, you fought badly. I'll show you how to fight. In 10 minutes, some 15 people burst into the basement and started beating us with batons, sticks, guns. They hit me in the eye and I thought they knocked it out. The beating went on for about 20 minutes and then they left. Soldiers settled along the perimeter of the village, probably more than 1,000 soldiers. No one was allowed to leave the village, and we waited every minute that they would invade the village. It was August 15-16. Moscow was in coup. They were only waiting for an order from the headquarters to destroy Haterk. These trenches were dug by Soviet soldiers. From the trenches, the village was in full view. All along the perimeter were such trenches. They are still visible. Soldiers stood at each meter and waited for the order to attack us. On August 22, we left Haterk. I remember how inspired were the residents who were seeing us off. I was sure that the first thing Yeltsin would do was to focus on Karabakh, as the most horrible situation was here. People here were under double pressure from both the army and the SWAT. We were leaving the villagers saying, Russia is totally different now, and all this will be over soon. But it was not the end. Violence, aggression, killings, deportation were not only expanding their geography, but their methods were becoming more brutal as well. Azerbaijan warmly supported the putsch of August. However, right after the failure of the State Committee of the State Emergency, GKCP, on August 30, 1991, Baku completely rejected the Soviet legal heritage, denouncing the 70 years of Azerbaijani SSR, a period of occupation by Russia. The national chauvinist policy of Azerbaijani authority was not confined by even the formal limitations of the Soviet state any longer, and took on the nature of absolute licentiousness and lawlessness. From that time, the genocide of Armenian nation by Azerbaijan was implemented through open military aggression in especially sophisticated forms using forbidden weaponry. In the peaceful Soviet time, at the end of the 20th century, Azerbaijan continued Turkey's policy of expansion of the beginning of the century, still using the same methods of medieval brutality and vandalism. The global objective of that policy was the expansion of habitat, taking under siege the territories of perennial, uninterrupted habitation of indigenous Armenian population. Implementation methods: annihilation, deportation and depriving of the Armenian population of their motherland, extermination or appropriation of Armenian cultural heritage. The purpose was to clean the territory of the Armenians by any means and to solve the Armenian question once and for all. It's obvious that it was the second attempt of genocide. The first one was a success. A huge area was cleaned of the Armenians, and they undertook the second attempt in Karabakh. From the legal point of view, it certainly was a genocide. On the way to their goal, no one was taking account of the victims among the civilians and the many villages that were simply erased from existence. After a while, no traces of Armenian presence were left there, like in many other places. I've personally seen photos of ruined cemeteries, broken crossstones and other monuments. So the problem was not only cleaning the area, but also erasing the culture, the memory, excluding the possibility of Armenians ever returning there. It was an organized genocide of an entire nation. They planned to deport all Armenians from the ancient Armenian land, and were doing it in the most horrible ways, like the Turks did during the genocide in the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries. It's very difficult to even evaluate such a crime. As per Viktor Krivopuskov's definition, the ring operation became an event organized against the Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh that was unprecedented by its scale and brutality, and Afghanized by its content. On May 1, 1991, the Senate of the United States of America unanimously passed a resolution condemning the crimes committed by the USSR and Azerbaijani authorities against the Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. Children of Haterk. They have not seen the horrors of genocide and war. They are living on their land, where their grandfathers and great-grandfathers used to live for centuries. Azerbaijan's sinister plans in Haterk failed. But over there, right behind those high mountains, is the abandoned Getashen, whose residents until now are deprived of their motherland. Scattered all over the world, they still believe that their children will certainly return to their native Getashen. It has been dozens of years that the rights of hundreds of thousands of Armenians are ignored by the international agencies. For dozens of years, they do not have the opportunity to come back to their native homes. The ring operation, just like many other crimes by Azerbaijan against Armenia, has not received due legal and political assessment up until today. The Nuremberg for ring operation is still ahead.